Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about frequency modulation in all of its different manifestations, which include exponential or pitch FM, linear FM, through zero FM, which most of the time is also linear FM, but it has some tricks up its sleeve, and phase modulation, which indirectly is also frequency modulation. So first, well, what's the difference acoustically? How do they sound different? I chose this little reactor ensemble because here I can easily switch between the different modes, between exponential, linear, and linear through zero FM. So now let's listen to it and kind of try to observe the characteristics. And let's start with exponential. So I hit the note. As we can hear, this not only affects the sound, but also the pitch. Then let's go to linear FM and see how that sounds. Well, here we have a somewhat similar behavior, but it's a little bit different. If you listen, here at the early stages, we only hear the effect increase, and only at a certain level, I think it was about 1.9, we can then hear the pitch increase as well. So let's listen to it again. Yeah, it was about around 1 where the pitch started increasing. Now let's switch to the last one, to linear through zero FM. Okay, now this one is totally different. The effect sounds very similar, but the pitch remains stable. And this is why people love through zero FM, because it sounds very musical. You can use it on melodies and everything without destroying the harmonic relations in your tracks. So, the last one, phase modulation, I will show you in the grid. Well, we see these two oscillators here. This one is the carrier, this one is the modulator. Was the same, by the way, in the reactor ensemble. And now here, when I open this up, I actually increase the phase modulation. This is the phase input of the oscillator. And you might already hear that it sounds very similar. And that's because it actually is the same thing, at least under these very special circumstances. And we will talk about, under which circumstances it sounds the same, under which circumstances it sounds different. And it is the same. And we'll actually talk about this. So I have a little graph here, which we will use to visualize what's going on. I mean, you don't have to care about what's here. That's just to make the graph actually work the way it does. And a little explanation here to this XY matrix. On this x-axis here, we have octaves, and here we have corresponding frequencies in hertz. I mean, this layout does not match what we have on keyboards, like A4 being 440 hertz. I just use it to display the ratio, how they relate to each other, right? And if you want to plot this out, you get a curve like this, actually. This is an exponential curve, and for those interested, that's the formula. Function of x equals 2 to the power of x, which in other words means we have a doubling of the frequency every octave. So the first octave in this case would be at 200 hertz. The second octave would be at 400 hertz. The third one already on 800 hertz. The fourth on 1600, 3200, and so on. And if I zoom out here, you can see this curve gets steeper and steeper and steeper until we eventually could not even distinguish it from an absolute vertical line. So, but plus minus 1 octave is what interests us. We can use to display we want. Let me see if that's the right one. Yeah. Okay, so let's assume we play a note at the second octave, whatever frequency this is. In this case, that's 400. And now we want to modulate this sine wave, and we will modulate the pitch input, which means we modulate on this axis, and let's say we modulate 1 octave down and 1 octave up. In terms of the pitch input, this is symmetric, right? 1 octave down, 1 octave up. So let's display this real quick. That was give us this modulation, and we can see here that at the lower end, we would go from 400 hertz down to 200 hertz. But then on the other hand, other side, we would go from 400 hertz up to 800 hertz. This is due to the exponential nature of pitch, which means we pitch a lot more up than we pitch down. So we go from here to here, but on the other side from here to up here. So the center of the frequency between 200 and 800 hertz, well, that's not 400, that would actually be 500. That's why we hear the pitch rising so much whenever we open the exponential pitch knob. So what we see here is a representation of linear frequency modulation. And when you look at this line, you can now already see why it's called linear. Because the relationship between the frequency input, which we have here, and the frequency is 1-to-1, right? Function of x equals x. There's no math in between. So if I do the same thing here, and I modulate from, let's say, 2 volt, the unit doesn't really matter, from 2 volt to 1 volt, and from 2 volt to 3 volt, we have an absolute symmetric picture. We go from 200 hertz to 100 hertz, from 200 hertz to 100 hertz, and from 200 hertz to 300 hertz, which will keep our pitch stable. Now, as we have heard, the pitch did eventually change. Now, why did this happen? It was stable at the beginning, but then it changed pitch. Now, the reason for that is, well, when we move this modulation a bit to the side, so where we apply more modulation, now it's still completely symmetric. However, now here we have reached pretty much the end, not only of this graph, but also of what the oscillator understands. Because here it is not oscillating anymore, it is standing still. And if I now go here and increase the modulation further, I can move this side more up, but I cannot move this side further down. Because below 0 is just not defined. The oscillator will say, well, I'm standing still. I cannot do more than not oscillate. So every state below 0 is just not defined. So that's linear frequency modulation. And now let's have a look at its extended version, which is called through 0 FM. So as you can see, now all the negative values are defined. And as we discussed before, well, we can increase modulation with linear FM if we want it to stay symmetric until to this exact point. Now the question is, of course, well, what happens now if we go in negative territory? How does the oscillator interpret this? Well, what it does is actually it inverses its direction. Instead of running forward, it will now run backward, which will result in an inverted phase. This will be the exact same signal, but it will be 180 degrees rotated. So let's have a look at this and how this looks and why exactly do we even speak of rotation. So here I have a representation of a sine wave, which also happens to be the simplest waveform we can have. And while pretty much everyone might be familiar with this shape here, not everyone who is maybe not so familiar with math knows exactly why this is actually equal to a circle. And yeah, here I have the relationship displayed. I mean, the amplitude here is always corresponding with the position here in the circle, and we move around the phase here, which has exactly the length of 2 pi. And so you can see that everything is related, but first we want to talk about frequency modulation, especially through 0 FM, and how this looks like. So we're here, the oscillator is, I'm playing a note and it's happily rotating. Then some modulation signal comes in and tells it to rotate faster. So it does that and the frequency increases. On the other hand, on the opposite side, when the modulator drops below 0, the speed will slow down and it will oscillate slower as expected. So at some point we reach kind of the tipping point where we reach 0. So the oscillator stands still wherever it happens to be. Now, a linear frequency oscillator, or an oscillator that only allows linear frequency modulation, will then just stand still and wait until the signal becomes positive again and then start oscillating again in forward direction. However, through 0 FM oscillator does know how to deal with the negative signal and just inverses direction and starts running backwards until the sum of its modulation signals, the internal phase plus the external frequency modulation, are again bigger than 0, and then it starts running forward again. And this game goes on and on and on and on. So here we have the phase position, but I think we'll leave that for now and talk about it later when we talk about phase modulation. No, actually we're talking about it right now. If I pick this handle here and we look at the 2 points, how they behave, and especially the phase position here, we can see I cannot move the frequency handle without affecting the phase position, and vice versa. I cannot move that one because it didn't figure out how to do it. But as you can see, these two are linked as if there are some gears in between, and you can imagine when you turn on the other side, something happens on the other side. But maybe to a different extent. And this is exactly where phase modulation and frequency modulation differ. When I change the phase modulation, I will affect the frequency and end up having frequency modulation, and vice versa. But how the oscillator reacts to different changes in amplitude and modulation strength signal, that will cause the difference. There is a very specific case, and we will start with that case, where phase modulation and frequency modulation through 0 frequency modulation are actually absolutely identical. And this is when the modulator and the carrier are both a sine wave. And now let's change over to the grid and look if we can prove this claim, at least visually. So welcome back to Bitwig. Here, as we have seen before, we have the phase input of the oscillator, which is modulated by another sine wave oscillator. So here we have phase modulation. And we could get exponential FM by connecting this oscillator to this input, which is the pitch input. Okay, so exact same result that we have heard in reactor. So, but we want through 0 FM because exponential FM, it might be useful in some cases, but most of the time it's not. So how to do that? Actually, you have to pick an LFO, because an LFO has a frequency input. This is not a pitch input. This directly changes the pitch in a linear fashion. So you also have to change it to kilohertz, and you have to turn off its internal phase. And I would enable this so that we stay phase locked with the other oscillators here. And now first, since this oscillator is now completely standing still, let's connect it here. So as this one is completely standing still, we have to get a phase signal from outside. And for that, we use our trusted phaser, which is exactly the section here. Turn up phase. And yeah, you might also have to enable bipolar mode. And now if I hit the note, we can see, well, there are now 180 degrees rotated against each other, but both perfect sine waves. Yeah, here's the proof. Actually, I need to enable this. So now they're completely overlaid. That's why I added the phase shift here, because for visual comparison, I want them to be phase aligned. Now, what about the frequency modulation? Let's duplicate this oscillator, remove the frequency shift. Let's make sure that phase reset is enabled, just so that nothing moves around in the oscilloscope. And now we can open this frequency lob. The modulation amount is quite extreme, but now you can see here what's happening. And let me switch over to that. That sounds pretty much like phase modulation, and especially like the other through zero modulation. However, now the resolution is way too low, so we have to do something about this. Let's get from level an attenuation. Let's reduce that to, like, I don't know, quite a lot. Okay, now we have a lot better control. And now I can also prove to you that it is exactly the same. So when I increase the amount of phase modulation here, you see what's happening. And now I do the same thing here at the frequency input. Well, and these two waveforms, well, I cannot adjust it perfectly. These two waveforms overlap perfectly. And that is because in this special case, phase modulation and through zero frequency modulation is exactly the same. But we can get differences pretty quickly. As soon as we change this, well, to something not quite sine wave, but what is it doing here again? Where's the triangle? Here. So if we change the modulator to a triangle, you will see a difference immediately. Triangle. It's probably the screen recording software which is making these little white blocks. So if we increase phase modulation here now, you can see here there's a sharp edge, and it creates these kind of devil's horns almost, which I can also already predict that this will create more overtones than before. And then we do the same thing, increase the modulation amount here. Okay, and this one almost didn't change at all. I mean, if we would compare it, it is a bit different. But the edges here stay completely rounded. And now, obviously, this will sound different. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. So in general, not in every single lost case, I do not know if that's empirically true, but in all the cases where I tested it through zero FM, always sounds a bit rounder, a bit softer. And that doesn't mean it sounds better, but definitely different, especially if you use some more complex signal to modulate, like, for example, a wavetable oscillator. But now there's something I wanted to talk about before, so let's switch back to a sine wave real quick. And here as well. So, let's get them to overlap. Okay, so now we can see they're almost the same. But if I play a note 1 octave higher, we can see that with this, for this oscillator, which is red, the modulation stays the same, but for the through 0 FM oscillator, the modulation amount dropped significantly. And it will get even worse when I play an octave higher again. And it will continue to progress like that until the modulation from here almost doesn't matter anymore. So why is this? Well, it has to do with the exponential behavior of pitch. Imagine we have a 100 hertz signal and we modulate this with the linear input that we have here. So we add 10 hertz and we subtract 10 hertz. So we go from 100 to 110 and down to 90. Now, if we play a higher note, let's say at 1000 hertz, well, the modulation signal is still 10 hertz. So we go from 1000 to 1010 and to 990. So, but before it was like 10% of the absolute frequency, and now we modulate like 1%. So the higher the frequency, the more we actually need to increase the modulation. Bitwig allows us to do this relatively simple, relatively easy. So first we need an input that delivers us the pitch. We need to know which note is actually playing so that we can translate the signal then into something else. And we have this fancy little module that does all the math for us, and it converts a pitch signal to hertz. And actually, for it to work correctly, we have to switch it to kilohertz. Now I want an attenuation knob in between and then a modulator out. I can hook all of this up. And now we control the amount of modulation. Actually, it has to be 32. Okay. With this here, and now we can turn this fully up and use this attenuation knob to control the amount of modulation. Now let's see how it sounds. Or let's make these frequencies overlap again, more or less. So now we see that they stay exactly the same, and you can also see if you really look closely that the modulation amount increases slightly whenever I play a higher note. And this one is a bit more, and this one is almost nothing. Okay, this is basically it. This is the through 0 FM oscillator in Bitwig, but the concepts, of course, of through 0 FM apply to pretty much everything, since whatever you have out there. Unfortunately, there are not too many who actually support it. So let's listen to some examples with some more complex signals, like from a wavetable oscillator. And well, these are some I imported from Serum, so let's use one of them. Maybe the acid lifter. And because I'm lazy, I'll just duplicate this oscillator so I don't have to select the waveform again. So, okay, first the phase FM. What I also like to do is tune the ratio from the modulator down, especially when the signal is complex, because you will get enough overtones already. So this is just a little tip. So you can get really rich signals. So this was phase FM. Now let's listen to how through 0 FM. tune it down. Well, two things. First, we realized that it sounds a bit softer, not so edgy. And we can also see that we constantly have some movement in here. But I think we cannot attribute this to the nature of through zero FM. But I do think that the wavetable oscillator, or this waveform, has some DC offset. So unfortunately, we cannot correct for this, but yeah, it will affect what you do if the wavetable is not balanced. On the contrary, we have seen that the phase modulator stayed, the phase modulation oscillator stayed completely stable. Maybe we find some. Yeah, this one is almost stable. Well, let's just look at some other. Yeah, it looks like these wavetables do not have any phase offset. That's just a random. It has slightly. That's probably something you cannot avoid completely, or it would be ridiculously complicated. Let's just take one of these and select the same one here. Additive harmonic organ. Okay. So this gives a better or fair comparison between the two signals, I think. Maybe we need a bit more range, so we can exchange this to an amplifier. So now we have the possibility to go above 100%. Okay. Now I'll do the phase oscillator, phase F. Let's try to get something similar. So I think we can tell, and I think this is almost always true, that through zero FM sounds a little bit beefier, but has less overtones. Especially the more overtones the modulator or the carrier has. Go back. Yeah, I think here the differences are very, very prominent. So, was there anything else I wanted to talk about? Yeah, just don't forget, we also have different modules here. For example, we can use a curve LFO. So we do not have to modulate a sine wave. We can modulate whatever we want and draw a curve in here. Or also on the modulator side, we can draw in whatever we want and have this through zero FM, have this, FM the heck out of it. And we also have, since newer versions of Bitwig, a wavetable LFO. So even with through zero FM, the modulator and the carrier can be wavetable oscillators, which can deliver extremely interesting results, be it phase modulation or frequency modulation, doesn't matter. Experiment with these two things, you will get amazing results. Okay, now this one is unipolar. No, this one has to remain at 100%. And especially also, in general, frequency modulation is involves usually some envelope or LFO, which controls the amplitude of modulation, like so, for example. Yeah, now it's a bit extreme because these two have a ton of overtones. But if I, for example, return this to sine wave again, this one as well. So like this, you can get really interesting results when you just modulate the amount. And then, of course, like the DX7 does it, for example, let's kill this. Go back to the sine wave. Duplicate this. We are not limited to one stage of modulation. We can modulate the modulator. And let's see how this sounds different. Yeah, and then of course we can continue this. We can modulate the modulator of the modulator. We can combine through 0 FM and then modulate the modulator with phase FM. Yeah, whatever our heart desires. So I hope I could give you a little overview on how FM works and how it sounds and how to use it to some extent. I might go in deeper with some sound examples in the future because it's really deep. I mean, this is just a technical concept, how it works. But you can create pretty much, not any kind of sound, but a whole palette of sounds. And I have not reached the bottom of that sound design well myself. So I might be talking about it in the future. In the meantime, I hope you liked the tutorial, you learned something. So please like and subscribe and see you next time.